Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Chantell, Ilbury, one of South Africa's leading scenario strategists, and is also co-author of best-selling books on strategy. She will present on future scenarios and predicting the potato's future. Thank you, Chantell.
Well, thanks, David. You've given me 5 extra minutes. That's wonderful. Is that because I'm a woman and I talk more, or just 5 extra minutes? Thank you very much for inviting me to be here and to share a little bit of the work that I do and a little bit of the strategic thinking that I follow. I've worked very closely with another gentleman called Mr. Clem Sunter, who was with Anglo American, and we've worked together for about 12 years now in the area of strategy. And I must say, going back to the Ellen show and one of the comments that came out yesterday, when I was also asked, well, why are you going to Edinburgh? What are you going to be doing in Edinburgh? I sort of skirted the issue and I said, well, I'm going to the WPC conference, thinking that WEF, WB, IMF, World Political Congress. And if they delved a little bit further, I then said, well, actually, it's the World Potato Congress. And do you know that potatoes rank 3rd behind rice and wheat, and they're the most important crop grown for human consumption. So they are highly strategic. So thank you for allowing me to be part of your 2-day process and some of your strategic thinking in terms of how you position yourselves going forward. And I know that this talk is called Global Scenarios and Possible Futures for the Potato Industry, but what I would like to share with you now in this half-hour session or 30-minute session is to take you a little bit out of potatoes for a moment, just a moment, and have a look at the world around us and look at the world through a set of scenarios, because as businesses, whether you are a grower, whether you're a retailer, whether you're in processing, wherever you are along that supply chain, one wants to be positioning for the future, and we're already seeing there are some trends that are identifying what that future could look like. But there are some real uncertainties that could perhaps take us to a less predictable future than we think that future is going to be. So I'd like to share with you my take on the global scenarios, what the next 5 to 10 years could look like in general, and then I'd like to extrapolate that into the types of questions as the potato industry you should be asking, and obviously you're different players in different parts of the chain, so in extrapolating those questions, what does it actually mean for you positioning going forward? What are some of your strategic options, and what would some of your tactical options looking at that future be? And I want to just share very quickly the underpinning of even the type of questions that we ask strategically, and it is through the 3 books that my co-author and myself have written over the last 10 to 12 years. And it just gives a feeling of how one should be looking at that future through your business, through the type of questions. The first book was The Mind of a Fox, and The Mind of a Fox really says if you're looking forward into the future, you need to be looking at 2 broad areas to develop your framework for thinking. What is certain about that future, and what is uncertain? And I think strategically in the past, we were able to populate a number of certainties. And then we looked at the couple of uncertainties and we tried to put that flexibility into our business, and we developed our strategy. But I think what we've seen recently, particularly in the last few years, is that list of certainties is declining and the list of uncertainties is increasing. So more and more we have to live in a world of uncertainty, and therefore to deal with uncertainty we need to build a set of scenarios. So what is certain and what is uncertain? And then as a business and as a player, what can you influence in terms of the environment or yourselves going forward, and what is outside of your control. What's within your control and what's outside of your control. And that was the framework that we used to develop our thinking, and that came out in The Mind of a Fox. We then worked with companies, we worked in different industries, and we've worked across many different countries. And we then realized strategy is dynamic. So when you're thinking about that future, you've got to constantly be thinking what it's going to look like. And that means you've got to understand the system that you're in and the parts that make up that system. And as scientists, you know, if you can analyze a system for long enough, it almost can become predictable. So strategically, we don't talk about the system, we talk about the game. And we say, what game are you in? Because the game is made up of players. And players sometimes make rational decisions, but most times make irrational decisions. And therefore, the game changes. And in the game of agriculture, it stretches across not only agriculture, science, it brings the consumer in, it brings politics in, it brings economics in. So it's a very complex game. And one has to understand all the players in that game in order to understand where agriculture itself is even going. And in your sense, of course, in the potato industry, we have the health issue coming into play, because there are trends that are coming out, and the potato, as I heard yesterday, the myth is that the potato makes you fat. So, you know, you've got a number of issues that you have to contend with in terms of positioning yourselves. And then the third concept that we use is Socratic dialogue, which comes from our third book, Socrates and the Fox, and I'm very pleased to hear that this is the Athens of the North, so I'm in the right place to be talking Socrates. But we do use Socratic dialogue in our strategic thinking, because you have to question the assumptions that you make about the future. And already we've heard in the last few days, we have very different players on the global playing field. And assumptions we've made in the past about what the future is going to look like, I think really need to be questioned as to what that future going forward is going to look like. So based on those three things, I'd like to share with you how we see the global scenarios very broadly. I will put a little bit around where agriculture could fit in, and then I'd like to extrapolate it, as I say, in terms of the type of questions the potato industry should be asking. And we've based our thinking on the fox and the hedgehog. And some of you will know the fox very well, some of you will know the hedgehog very well. But we honestly believe that if you're looking at strategy going forward, the fox knows many things. The fox holds a set of multiple scenarios all the time. And based on those multiple scenarios, identifies flags that would indicate a shift in scenario and identifies probabilities. And if a probability has got 10% probability of a scenario playing out, the fox would keep that scenario on the radar screen, but not put a strategic decision to it. But if some flags in the environment start to go up and the probability increases at a 50%, 60% probability, the fox would be putting decisions into play. Versus the hedgehog, who is a different type of thinker, and the hedgehog sees a single projected future. And on that single projected future, they base a strategy. And if you think before 2007, what was happening in the world, it was a growth scenario. And certainly it was described as the long boom scenario. So many people around the world, many decision makers, many players almost got the hedgehog view of a single projected future. The long boom scenario really was driven by China coming onto the playing field in 1978, 100th biggest economy to now the second biggest. India opening up its doors, less protectionist in the 1990s. We had technology superimposed, and you could start thinking, wow, the drivers for the long boom scenario are going to continue, so much so that outside of a couple of economic cycles and a couple of dips, you know, we're going to be getting into the super cycles. And certainly in commodities, and we're looking at food, and we're looking at some of the things around population growth, we could be starting to say, sure, food security, population growth, emerging middle class, this long boom, what are we going to be doing? But 2007 also took us out of the long boom scenario when a little flag came up, and that flag came up in the US, and it's said, well, house prices are starting to stabilize and they might actually be starting to decline. And when you have an economy that is 70% consumer driven, and they borrow and they spend based on asset prices and wealth continuing to go up, there's a little flag that says perhaps that global long boom scenario might not continue to be in play. And one should already say, what would that mean for the business, for our business? What scenario would we be going into? So I'd like to share with you our take on what we think those scenarios are. We've said there are two key uncertainties in the next 5 to 10 years that are going to face the global environment. It's going to be whether we're going to continue in a one world, globalized, fairly stable, integrated world, and that's the world that we have been in the last few years, or are we moving more and more to a divided world, far more fragmented, far more unstable. Underpinning that are the geopolitical tensions that are showing up in the world, perhaps even things like social unrest. And I would even put the bigger issues around environment into the one world versus divided world in terms of the type of decisions that we're going to be making about environmental issues. And then the other axis that builds our scenarios is around the global economy. Are we going back into a stronger global economy, or are we going to stay in a weak global economy until at least 2017, 2018? So is the V coming into play next year, or are we really going to be in a low growth scenario? So there are 4 scenarios that could play out. The 2 mainframe scenarios are between hard times, one world, and we stay in a low growth scenario, and we've already experienced the hard times. And we've also experienced the other scenario, which we call the ultraviolet, the UV. So some countries have stayed in the U since 2008, certainly Europe, unfortunately, being one of them, and the US. But China went back into growth. After going from long boom into hard times, China went back into growth of 9.7%. So you couldn't say that China was in the U. So we actually moved from hard times into ultraviolet, which is the 2-speed scenario. Now, what's interesting about those scenarios, if you just very quickly played them out as to what they mean, and what you would want to be doing is saying, what does it mean for us in terms of growing, in terms of commodities, in terms of input costs, in terms of supply chain, in terms of consumer behavior changing. But if you think about hard times, and that's the scenario that we have been in for a little while, one of the things is the capitalist model is being questioned in hard times. People are holding on to cash a lot more. There's niche investments in terms of strategy, so it is becoming a lot more niched in terms of where you invest. There is investment in food and in social projects, so that's actually increased in a hard time scenario. There's been more regional coordination between economies. The IMF has been playing a bit of a wider role in order to stabilize things. But global efficiencies have probably declined a little bit because it's become far more localized. And efficiencies found at the moment in a hard time scenario have been more in the local sense rather than the global efficiencies. And certainly it's a lower growth rate. But what's interesting in hard times is the research and development that's gone into play. And we've seen that in the scientific field, and certainly you've seen it in agriculture, where there was a decline in R&D in agriculture. That's now started to come up, and there's huge amount of interest in R&D in the agricultural sector. And that is, as was talked about yesterday, because there's not enough land. We can't expand generally on land outside of parts of Africa, but we can increase yield. So farming is becoming more and more scientific. New technologies are coming into play, and innovation. But what's also happened there is the consumer. The consumer has changed behavior, because when you only have a certain amount of money to spend, you want to spend it wisely. And it's not necessarily going to be about cost. So the consumer, I don't think, is necessarily going to the lowest cost product, but they're going to the cost plus quality product. So the value proposition is becoming very, very important. And I think what goes with that too is brand. So one of the things that you're going to be looking at is brand and branding right away across the chain, the combination between quality, and cost and a shift in consumer behavior. But I want to just also tackle the ultraviolet very quickly, because Africa has certainly seen the ultraviolet scenario in play in the last 2 years. So we've heard a little bit about Africa, but the ultraviolet scenario is an emerging market scenario. So there is a scramble for resources, but what's also coming out in ultraviolet is we are getting blocks starting to form. And blocks are going to be very important going forward in terms of where we trade and what relationships and who those players are. And resource blocks, will blocks become blocks because of access to resources or access to markets. And we've seen the access to resources not only in Africa playing out, but certainly in Australia and in New Zealand, tying up those resources in certain blocks, and therefore a shift in players and the type of relationships. So I think globally we're going to see a very big shift in the traditional blocks who've played strongly. European Union has been a strong bloc, whether it will continue as the European Union as we see it today, or whether it will look slightly different into the future. BRICS has become a bloc that's become more interesting. It's an emerging market bloc in general. South Africa is part of it, but that brings Africa onto the continent. But I think there are going to be other blocs that are forming as well. So that, from a business perspective, is going to be very interesting. If we were to go into the new balls please, which is a growth scenario, the growth scenario probably won't be a movement straight from hard times into new balls please. It'll probably be a pathway, hard times through ultraviolet and into the new balls please. And that will definitely mean we have a change of players. The economic power shift will definitely, and we've already seen that happening, but will definitely be towards the east. The different relationships that are going to come out, the different blocks that will then form because of that economic power shift. But what else will come out in new balls please is also we're seeing a lot of regulation coming into play. So again, you're in different countries, but regulation is becoming one of the key issues, and certainly for business. And regulation is not only becoming tight across sectors, but in some places it's becoming overbearing regulation versus enabling regulation. So I think that's going to play across the global environment. If you're a global player, it'll play to different countries you're operating in. If you're more localized, regulation will be one of your key issues that you would be wanting to look at. It's going to be much harder to get credit in a growth scenario, so it's going to look very different. And then it comes back to resources that we've heard in the last 2 days, because it is the key thing about a growth scenario, and this is what we've heard, and I think we've been talking to the growth scenario quite a lot in the last few days, is efficiency, efficient use of resources. So efficiency will be the key. Resource efficiency we've heard a lot about. Efficiently taken out of the ground if it's minerals, efficiently grown. I hesitate to put in the genetically modified concept, but having worked a bit in the agricultural sector around the world, it seems to be a bit of a given into the future that it will be genetically modified foods that are at play if you look at food security. And the resources that are going to be interesting, that will certainly be required for a growth scenario, but could well be the resources that also take us from one world back down to a divided world, are around, well, food, water, and energy. And the interplay between those three is going to be critical. And where water has not been strategic globally in the past, water is becoming probably the most strategic resource going forward. And if you wanted a real growth scenario, it's going to all be about water. We've already looked at energy, and we're well on the way into alternative forms of energy, which will definitely be part of a growth scenario. But the resource that's going to be under stress is going to be water. And again, what we heard yesterday, that's going to shift. Where there is water, where there's water scarcity, the type of crops that you grow, where you're going to add value to those crops, not necessarily in the same places. And I think that we're going to see a very different world. So if you come back to agriculture and you think of agriculture in the past, be it a farmer, how you farm, be it the process of how we get it to market, how we actually sell to the consumer who's been fairly traditional. I think the game is going to change completely. And anybody who's sitting with the old game and tinkering in the old game, probably in the next 10 to 15 years will be out of the game of the future. And I think innovation is going to be one of the key elements. Innovation in terms of not only efficiencies, but radical innovation in the way we do things. So it's an interesting scenario to play out, but our take at the moment is the growth scenario is an outlying scenario. We don't think it's the scenario in the next 3 to 4 years. The scenario that one would want to look at is forked lightning, which is the worst case scenario, because if we did go into a second financial crisis, then certainly we're going to see a very different world for a number of years to come. A forked lightning scenario probably will be massive losses, destruction across most of our asset classes. There'll be a flight to quality and safety. There'll definitely be supply disruptions if we formally went into a forked lightning scenario. There'll be increasing unemployment. What's that going to do to consumer and to costs and where you're positioned in terms of your products? And there's probably going to be quite a destruction of resources if we do go into the forked lightning. So there is a worst case scenario beyond where we've seen the world as it is today. And if you think about it and you think of some of the uncertainties that are coming up, the probability of that forked lightning scenario seems to be on the radar screen increasing. So the 4 scenarios we see: mainframe between hard times and ultraviolet. That's where you're probably going to play in the next 5 to 10 years. What would your strategies be there? Connect the dots. If you think it's the forked lightning, what will it mean for you in terms of your business? And then, of course, position as the growth scenario, because at some stage we will get to a growth scenario, but it's timing as to what you're going to do there. So our flags for growth are, if we were to go to the new balls please, a drop in US unemployment, and that flag's not really up. We would put 7% as our positioning for a growth scenario to come out, and a drop in national debt to GDP ratio. That flag's definitely not up yet, so that's why we think the growth scenario is an outlying scenario. Our more interesting flag is between hard times and ultraviolet, because that really does depend on China at this point in time. And if China can maintain its growth between 8 and 10%, then it is the ultraviolet scenario at play, and there's huge opportunity in that scenario. But if it falls between 5 and 6%, then certainly we're back into hard times. And the potential for that, if the growth did fall so dramatically in China, would be ultraviolet, hard times down to forked lightning, because there would maybe even be social meltdown in China. So we've got some interesting global paths that the world can follow. And of course, you're the potato. What's the potato going to do? I mean, there'll always be a place for potato, but it's just how much place, and the cost of it and doing business is really what one wants to look at. We've got one flag that would indicate the forked lightning, and that's over and beyond the fact that we are watching Greece at the moment, and of course the contagion and what would happen there, and Italy and Spain, and you know, the usual suspects as to what's out at the moment in terms of being talked about, because you put anything like that on an already unstable system and we could potentially go to forked lightning. But the real flag that we would look at for sustained forked lightning is looking at the US. And we would look at the US 10-year bond rate, and if it was to increase above 5%, then we think there's a real loss of faith in the US. People are pulling out, and the forked lightning scenario would definitely come into play. And that US 10-year bond rate sitting at about 2%, and so there is still faith. It is a safe haven at the moment, and it is still seen as being resilient, and there are some elements of growth. So we found the world quite interesting. Our probability at the moment, we give the hard times a 40% probability and ultraviolet 30%. We think the flag is slightly more towards hard times. 20% probability towards a forked lightning, and we watch that probability, and then 10% towards new balls, please. So that's our global view. Yours may be very different. Your industry is slightly different. So you would say, what does it mean for your industry in terms of those scenarios? But from a general commodity perspective, hard times, new balls, please, and ultraviolet are all good scenarios for commodities. For commodities in general, it's just the fork lightning that would be the negative. Okay, so how would you extrapolate that and take it into a strategic conversation? What are the type of questions that you would be asking yourselves? And I was just listening over the last day or two, and I think that if you were to first of all say, okay, let's understand our game, and because you're in the agricultural game, and in particular, you're a particular part of agriculture, although some of you are in other crops and you're multidisciplinary. But if we're looking at potato, the first question is to contextualize the industry itself and say, well, how's the global potato industry changed over the last 5 to 10 years? And where is it heading? Because some of the changes that have taken place also mean one can see perhaps where that game is actually going. So if you look at population growth that was talked about yesterday, and the population growth in places such as Asia and Africa, that's huge potential, and that's definitely changing, and both of them are opening up with huge opportunities. Water scarcity has come into play. Climate change is at play. We're already seeing the next 20 years apparently are set for us with what's already in the atmosphere. Dietary changes have started to be in play. That's a context change. Urbanization and the fact that we are more urbanized than rural, although that I think in time will also shift back to a rural environment. Biofuels have come onto the playing field, so those are some of the issues in terms of our context. Obesity, health focus, and the fact that, as I said, the potato has the myth of being a fatty food, or a food that produces fat, are all the things that would relate to your context. If you were to then say, well, what's your playing field, what's your scope, what would it look like into the future, you're all different players, so I can't scope yours out. But if you look at the potato industry in general, one would scope out from the grower out to the consumer, and then all the players along the way. And will that supply chain, and will that how we look at business even be the way into the future? Because we're also seeing a lot of consolidation. Players are playing differently from where they traditionally were niched. So I think even the playing field is going to look different with different types of players. But one could look at your scope, decide what your scope is. If you're a grower, you obviously would be looking at what varieties, and if you're in retail, you'd be looking at the markets, but you would scope your own game. What I would be interested in is the players, and we've heard quite a lot about the players. Strategically, who are the players that would advance or retard your industry, and how would you handle them in the future? Now, the players, the consumer is becoming a massive player. And one of the things that interested me yesterday in terms of consumers, we are more educated, we are more informed, we want choice, we don't necessarily only want to go for cost. And I saw a fabulous presentation yesterday about how when you go to the market or the supermarket and you look for potatoes, it's really just a sack of potatoes here, or a sack of potatoes there, or a sack of potatoes there, versus a future where it could look like the delicious potato, the healthy potato, the light and fluffy potato. And I would love to be able to go and have my choice of potato. So players are very important. How they're changing their behavior, consumers in particular, will change your game, because consumers, as well as the supply chain, will also be the players that will ask for efficiencies. They'll also be the players that eventually drive environmental issues. And although we think it's governments that will drive environmental issues, I think political will. And when we see what happened at COP17 in Durban, and we see where the conversation goes and then doesn't go, I'm not too sure that it will necessarily be governments that actually drive the environmental agenda in terms of policy, because that political will is very different. But governmental players, distributors, processors, growers, suppliers are all players in different ways. So one would want to look at those relationships, look at those partnerships, look at along the supply chain where those partnerships need to be in terms of positioning your business. And then I was thinking to myself, what are the rules of the game? Because what are some of the certainties? And we've heard those certainties. Government and public are more health conscious. That's a definite certainty. I don't think that's going to go away. It doesn't matter what the scenario is. There is going to be global population growth, and we know where that growth is going to be. That's a certainty. We're not going to go away with that. There is consolidation in the retail sector. So you've got very few players in that retail sector that you're selling to. If it's the retail sector you're in, consolidation is not going to go away. But what are the rules to win in the potato industry? What are some of the certainties? And I think that they're going to be some of the following: quality plus innovation plus cost leadership. If you can put those three things together, it'll be a rule to win. A strong differentiated brand, because I think brand is going to be very important. Accessibility of consumers and potential consumers to the product is going to be a rule to win. The ability to develop, attract, retain talent, because skills are going to be important into the future. And then something I also heard yesterday that I would also go with as a rule to win is that young people will need to stay with potatoes. So one of the clear rules to win is an appeal to young people, and that's a different generation. And how do you appeal to that in terms of the potato, to take the potato with them into the future? What are some of the uncertainties that you're going to face? Well, again, we heard a number of them yesterday: water, power, climate conditions, price of oil. And if you look back to those scenarios and we look at the oil price, we've got to take that if it goes to $150 a barrel, that would certainly shift the scenarios back towards hard times and even maybe down to fork lightning. So at $150 a barrel, we're pretty close at the moment. And you put things like Iran and some of the other uncertainties into play, we could be quite close. Economic cycles, competitor strategies. Something that wasn't really mentioned yesterday, but it's an uncertainty in a number of countries around the world, is land reform, and also land grabs and ownership of land, which also comes into play. So, you know, one would be wanting to factor those uncertainties in. And then you would play out your scenarios. Now, what I'm going to do in the workshops just after lunch is take these global scenarios, and then with a panel, we're going to take the global scenarios into scenarios for the potato industry. What would the potato industry look like through each of those scenarios? What would the supply chain look like? Who are the players? What are the positives? What are the negatives? So the takeaway from that would be a set of potato industry scenarios that you then could start saying, well, based on that, how am I going to play the game? Where are my strengths and weaknesses? What are the opportunities and threats? What options do I have, strategic and tactical? And then what sort of decisions do I need to be making? And then finally, in our conversation, and I think it's very important as players in a game that is changing, is to say, if you want to stay playing in the game, well, what would your meaning of winning be? And if you want to look at 5 years' time or 10 years' time, what would the meaning of winning be? And I've heard a lot about the potato, the role of the potato, and where the potato should be positioned. And it is a very important vegetable. So really, where do you want to see that potato positioned in 10 years' time? And then, if you say as such a critical ingredient, part of the plate, an integral part of the plate, well then I think there's a lot of work to do between now and then to actually get it there. And there's going to be behavioral change, there are going to be efficiencies that are going to have to come into play, there's going to be sustainability that you're going to be looking at, and there's going to be communication that's going to be one of the key elements of the game. So on that note, and with 1 minute to spare before I see the card, I'd like to say thank you very much, and may the fox be with you.
Thank you, Chantell and David. I think today you've informed, educated, and created great food for thought for the future. I think from David's presentation, I believe that the message of us all having a part to play and that to achieve success, we have to work together is vital for our industry. And as David said, he does not know what potatoes will cost in 2020, but by achieving the results required in yield, quality, and waste, as David said, is the oxygen of sustainable productivity. Chantell is asking us to consider strategic questions that need to be answered. The challenge in life and in business is knowing what the right questions are. In this respect, I believe Chantell is spot on and can guide us in all to create a future that we'd want for our industry. So again, finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to both our speakers, and I hope you all continue to have a great World Potato Congress. Thank you.